Hi everyone, welcome again to another episode on Beyond Biz. And today I have with me Simon, who is also an incoming candidate at Harvard Business School. Hi Simon.
Hey, how's it going, Abhijay?
Going well, going well. Could you quickly introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure thing. As he said, my name's Simon. I'm born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica. Came to the US when I was about 18, 19 for college and played college tennis here in Michigan at a school called Ferris State. And now pursuing a career in corporate finance. So I was at Motorola most recently before deciding to come and pursue my MBA at HBS.
Awesome. Let's just talk a little bit about your career in corporate finance. What got you interested in corporate finance in the first place?
Sure. When I was first starting out after graduating from my undergrad, I really didn't know where exactly I wanted to be in the world of accounting and finance. But I did my undergrad in those two majors, accounting, finance, and wanted to lean more towards the latter route. And I found this one website, which was really helpful, called CFI Institute. And it basically showed all the different career progressions that you can go within the world of finance. So you have like the banks, you have your institutions, so like your asset managers, and then you have your typical accounting firms and then your corporates. And for me, I found the corporate side as the more compelling one because it was an easier transition from accounting, which is the role that I was in post undergrad. And I thought it lined up well in terms of work-life balance. So did some research into that and found corporate FP&A as the most easiest transition and best work-life balance.
Awesome. So just for the viewers to get some perspective, could you walk us through a day in your current role as a financial analyst?
Sure. I think it really can vary depending on what kind of organization you're in. And I think that's the interesting thing about corporate FP&A. At Motorola specifically, it's a larger organization. So corporate FP&A is really broken, I would say, into 1 to 2 different categories, right? So you can think about it in terms of like a profit and loss statement. Mm-hmm. In corporate FP&A, you have the team that's working at the top of the P&L. So they're the ones who are basically funneling up information to the CFO so that the CFO can make large-scale decisions to help guide the organization. And then the more detailed that you get into the P&L and the closer that you get to a product or a business unit is kind of where I sat, so at the lower part of the P&L. And so my role was specifically helping teams like product managers, people in selling and marketing departments, help guide decision-making by managing their budgets, producing forecasts, doing variance analysis, and that type of work. So my role was really around that. And I think that dictated a lot of my work on a day-to-day. And I can talk more about that if you'd like.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, we had this discussion earlier as well, and we talked about a little bit about cybersecurity, right? So, how does your role fit in, like overlap with cybersecurity? Can you talk us a little bit about that?
Sure. So back to my point about managing or where I was on the P&L, I was much closer to the product than in corporate FP&A, where they're doing a lot of the consolidation. I was more in closer conversations with people on the product side. And so I worked a lot with the cybersecurity team who were developing our in-house encryption software and different cybersecurity solutions. So the really cool thing about that type of job is that you're making a lot of the decisions around spend for investing in a particular product. So I had product managers coming to me to present business cases and say, hey, we want to do this. It's going to cost X dollars to transform the product. Is this something that we can do? And that's really interesting because you get to see like unit economics of a particular cybersecurity product and make decisions on whether it's going to be profitable for the company, what the market opportunity is, so on and so forth. As far as the cybersecurity that I worked on, it was really this area called encryption and then also MDR, which is managed detection and response. So think of managed detection response as like a premium version of antivirus. So on your computer, you have antivirus software that protects you from malware and different kind of viruses. MDR is a more comprehensive solution that detects and responds to those viruses and uses sometimes more advanced tools like AI and machine learning to prevent them beforehand. So more of a preventative than a reactive solution. And I think that's a really interesting and growing space in the software kind of IT world. So it was a really, really cool place to be.
Awesome. And what do you think was your most significant learning in Motorola? And if you have any tips for folks, who are beginning their career and are from a finance background?
I think my biggest learning from Motorola is corporate finance is a job where you can really set yourself apart easier than I think in other finance roles. So when I think of like investment banking, everyone's really working 80, 90, 100-hour weeks. So that's kind of the standard and that's the expectation. In corporate finance, it's a much more laid back environment where companies typically demand 40 to 50-hour work weeks, depending on like the area in the US you are. So in Chicago, 50-hour work weeks is pretty much standard. But that really presents an interesting opportunity for people, because if you want to differentiate yourself and kind of build up your brand within the company and you're willing to do it, you can brute force work 60, 70, 80 hours and just get more work done compared to your peers. So it's a really easy environment to set yourself apart if you want to go that route. The downside with that is I think it's sometimes easy to be taken advantage of if you set a certain level of expectation coming into a job and you're working 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks just to kind of get more work done.
Right.
Then your peers, your managers might start to think, hey, this is to be expected. So that's a bit of a, a tricky situation, a delicate situation that you want to be mindful of going in.
Awesome.
I think, there might be some other things. Corporate finance as well, I would say, thinking of like exit opportunities might not have as many exit opportunities as other careers like consulting or investment banking, but generally work-life balance is really good. And then I would say, slower career progression. There's a very defined career progression in corporate finance where it's like 2 years financial analyst, then senior financialist, another 2 years, 3 years, then you end up becoming controller, director, VP, and then hopefully above VP to a more senior role. But there's a very long, drawn out progression, and the CFO track is a tough one to kind of build up to. So be mindful of that.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. People who are interested in corporate finance would definitely want to consider that. Let's talk a little bit now about the MBA, right? So first of all, many congratulations for getting into HPS. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of the people would really want to know about your journey, in terms of the GMAT and the application process, what things to avoid, and a lot more. So let's just start with the GMAT, right? Because that probably comes as an early step. So what do you think about the GMAT? Like, what were some of your tips for people who are preparing for the GMAT? Any resources that you'd like to share?
Sure. I think the most insightful piece of advice when I got for preparing for the GMAT is stick to one strategy and just follow that strategy 100% wholeheartedly. So there's tons of resources out there. There's Manhattan Prep, there's GMAT Prep, there is Target Test Prep, all these different solutions. And for the most part, they all do similar things. And it's very easy to get caught up of, well, I should try Manhattan Prep for quant, and I should do this one for verbal and mix and match. I feel like that's a very difficult kind of strategy to maintain, because you're just pulling from so many different places and getting, kind of maybe turned in different directions at different points in times. I feel like for me, I used Target Test Prep, and it did quant and verbal, and they had a very well-defined timeline of, okay, you need to get this done by X date and managing by a certain pace. And I think that just took a lot of the guesswork out of kind of my GMAT prep process. And so I followed that to the T. I spent maybe 3 months prepping and then doing another 3 months of like practice questions, mock tests, and so on and so forth. And in the end, I feel like that was the most effective approach. So I would say, long story short, pick one resource and stick to their process wholeheartedly. And if I was to recommend one single resource, I would choose Target Test Prep. I might be biased because it was the one that I used, but I do think they have a very, very strong quant prep. And I know they've been building out their verbal as well. So I would definitely recommend looking into TTP. Awesome. It's also cheaper.
Thanks for sharing the tip on the GMAT. One additional thing I would want to discuss with you is regarding coming from a non-traditional background, right? A lot of the times people applying to the top business schools are coming from either an IB background or a consultant background, especially to a school like Harvard. So how was that for you? Coming from a non-traditional background, were you afraid that this would lower your chances getting in, or were you discouraged from applying given that you're from a non-traditional background?
I would say there's probably a scale to non-traditional versus traditional, and I maybe fit more in the middle because you do have people from engineering or medicine who are also applying, and they're definitely more on the right hand of the spectrum, and then people from IB and consulting who are more on the left hand side of the spectrum. So I was glad because I fit somewhere more in that middle section, which gave me some level of comfort. But at the same time, yes, it's not the typical IB consulting role, which tends to be very favorable in the M7 schools. With that being said, I do remember speaking to one girl who was at HBS. Her name is Paulina, and she was super helpful contact for me throughout the application process. And one of the big things that she said was, early on when I was applying, she was like, know your value. And the reason is, when you're in the classroom, you're normally put into a group of 5 to 6 students, whether they're called learning teams or whatever. I forget what the name is for HBS, but you'll have 5 to 6 colleagues who really drive the learning within groups. And so HBS is looking for very unique perspectives and people that can bring different perspectives to those small groups. So when you have an overwhelming number of candidates from IB or consulting, you're going to be battling against a larger group of people who need to fit into these small defined groups where they want varied perspectives. So it actually helps being from a non-traditional background because you're competing probably against a smaller pool of people and you have a very fresh perspective to bring to those learning teams. So I think that's extremely valuable. And when you're writing your essays and presenting your candidacy, that's something that you need to kind of highlight and emphasize is why is that perspective different from the typical IB consultant? And how is that going to benefit the classroom experience for other students?
Definitely, that's a great way to look at it, right? Because a lot of the times people try to fit in, and sometimes I think especially schools like HBS are looking for you to stand out. So I think that is really a great piece of advice. I also see that you have cleared CFA level 1. So congrats on that. And I just wanted to get your perspective on how do you see that CFA being. Is it like something complementary to the MBA, or does it help in the MBA, or do you see these are two different unrelated fields? How do you see that?
I would say depending on what your career progression is and what kind of where you want to end up long term, they can be complementary. But for the most part, I see them as alternatives. So to dig on that a little bit deeper, when I was at my first internship or last internship in college, my manager had his MBA and his manager had his CFA. And they were kind of walking me through the pros and cons. Now, the CFA is very much relevant and probably more impactful than an MBA if you're going into an area that's like equity research or portfolio management or a very specialized finance activity. For example, managing a derivatives trading desk inside a corporation. In those instances, CFA is more applicable because it's a highly specialized kind of credential. And a lot of the times is either a requirement. I know for like portfolio management, it's sometimes almost a requirement or an unspoken requirement. Or like a derivatives trading desk, it's extremely helpful to set yourself apart. Now, if you're a little bit unsure of where you want to be in the finance world, I think the MBA is broadly more applicable and is more helpful in helping you make transitions or switches from one job to another. So MBA is definitely something that was more, I guess, helpful for me because I wasn't 100% sure where I wanted to be. And so I thought, in terms of career switching, it was going to be the more applicable kind of credential to go after. But then for other people, I think of things like timing, cost, and then, flexibility. So with CFA, it's a much longer time commitment because, it's 3 to 5 years based on how well maybe of an exam taker you are. There's a lot of study hours involved, roughly 300 hours per exam. But the cost is much cheaper, right? You're paying maybe in total $10,000 for all 3 exams and the study materials. An MBA, on the other hand, it's a 2-year program. It's far more expensive, but you do have to probably, unless you're doing part-time, leave your job to kind of pursue the MBA.
Right.
So there's a lot of trade-offs to kind of think through and just thinking which suits you more.
Awesome. I think that's a really great framework for people to decide which exam to, which field to go for. So thanks for sharing. Another question that, I have been getting a lot often is regarding working with an admissions consultant. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you recommend it? Do you not recommend it? What are your tips for somebody who's looking to work with an admission consultant?
Yeah, and I know in our intro call we spoke a little bit about this, so you have an idea of where I stand. But to give the viewers a bit of background, I hired an admissions consultant. I'm not sure if I'll say the name. Actually, no, I think I will say the name because I think if they're looking into this consultant, I would want them to do further diligence. I used Stacy Blackman in round 1, and I did their 3-school package, so paid maybe $7,000-8,000 for 3 schools. Obviously, it's a pretty hefty investment. You're hoping the payoff is kind of there. And I will say, I guess the good thing about admission consultants is that they run a very structured process. So they'll take you through their framework of prepping you for essays and preparation for the application cycle, help you kind of identify schools that maybe fit with your narrative best. But with that being said, because of the rigidity of the process, it's very easy for you to lose your authentic voice in your applications. So I found one of the things when I was applying to the 3 schools in round 1 is that I was more put into this box of what a typical MBA candidate should look like. And to be honest, I'm just not differentiated enough in that area to stand out. So when you go through an admissions consultant, this is very typical that can happen. You get put into a typical framework and you don't really get to show what's unique about you or what differentiates you from another candidate, right? Long story short, in round 1, I got rejected from all schools and I applied to Columbia, Booth, and Wharton. And I think Chicago was the only one that I interviewed at. So very low success rate in round 1 using admissions consultant. And, I will say some of the essays, so Wharton and Columbia, are maybe less personal. It's the same with Chicago, less personal than like a Stanford or HBS kind of essay. So, and then in round 2, I took a totally different approach. I went without an admissions consultant and really focused on just saying what I thought was in my heart, why I wanted to pursue an MBA, who I was, what differentiated me from other candidates. And I found, obviously, based on the admissions results, that my success in round 2 was a lot more favorable. So I got admitted to NYU, HBS, and Berkeley. And those were 3 of the 4 schools that I applied to in round 2. So much larger success rate in round 2. And I think just looking back on it and reflecting, a big part of it was being able to speak and write essays in a I would say an authentic voice is extremely important. And one thing that kind of the admissions consultant process took away from.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing the detailed, insights and your perspective on working with an admissions consultant. So, you just talked about some of the stories that helped you get these admits in round 2. So what do you think, maybe if you want to share a little bit about what was that thing that helped you get into the, let's say HPS. So I know you said about being very authentic, but maybe if you want to share a little bit more details on what was that thing that maybe clicked for you, let's say for HPS.
Yeah, I think there was a few things that lined up really well for me at HBS. Number one is I had a few friends in the program. So there was a girl, Paulina Ruiz, who I was able to connect with very early on in the process, and I got to know super well. And she actually invited me to kind of sit in on a class. So from there, I got to experience the case method firsthand. Didn't obviously get to participate, but I got to see how the class participates in in a case method setting, which was extremely valuable. I think the case method is an extremely special piece of the whole HBS experience, and something that the HBS admissions team wants you to recognize. So that was helpful. I think number two, Paulina gave me a really important piece of advice, which is dream big. When you're applying to Harvard, I think they like to see candidates who are ambitious. And sometimes, it's almost good to be ambitious in a way that people can laugh at you and be like, well, you're crazy for even thinking that's possible. Because that is the type of students that will ultimately succeed at HBS by going after these extremely hard, difficult, and I guess demanding either roles or goals. So she always said, make it very clear in your goal statement at HBS that you're going after something big. And I think from my background in Jamaica, and where I was interested within the energy sector in Jamaica, there was a very clear goal that was big, that I could go after. And then I think number three was recommenders. I took a more non-traditional approach to recommenders, where I didn't have my direct supervisor write my letter.
Okay.
And so I had someone at Motorola who I worked with in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And she spoke to basically a lot of my contributions that I did within Motorola outside of my work functions. And I think that was helpful, because for a school at Harvard, they care a lot about contributions to the community.
Yeah.
And so having a recommender who was able to speak on my contributions to a community outside of just my work, that was very helpful. So I think that was another aspect that was, beneficial towards my HBS application.
Awesome. And if you had to, let's say, revisit this process, right? Now, of course, you don't have to, you're going to Harvard, but let's say if you had to revisit the process and, apply again. So is there something you would do differently? Of course, I get the consultant part. You wouldn't work with a consultant, but anything else that you would do differently?
Yeah. And, on that point, I should have said earlier, I think I wouldn't say blacklist all consultants and don't go that route. I think for some students, an admissions consultant is very helpful, because especially in the early stages, they help you kind of understand what are the unique parts of your story, and help you really reflect. But at the end of the day, I think depending on the consultant that you go with, they can really draw out the process and make it more complicated. So it's really a trade-off, and I would spend a lot of time talking to the consultant, getting a feel for their process and understanding what value they're going to bring. And on that point, I would make sure if you are using a consultant, use someone who has either worked at an admissions consultant team for one of these M7 schools, or themselves has been recruited into a school and decided to go on the admissions consultant route. So they've seen the process. Now, okay, to your question, what I would do differently? I think the number one biggest thing that I would change about my process is I would have come up with a very clear goal before applying to my MBA and use a consistent story throughout. So I took a very different approach where, depending on the school I was applying to, I kind of tweaked my story and my goals. So for example, for Stanford, I said I wanted to go to product management, where I wasn't 100% sure that was true. I know I was interested in the space, but I wasn't necessarily sold on it. For HBS, I took one approach and said I wanted to go and work in energy finance. So totally different from product management. Berkeley was another different story. NYU, I said I wanted to do banking. So that was definitely not the recommended approach online, but it was a kind of a gamble that I took in my process. And I would say that for the most part, was very hard to manage, because you're dealing with so many different goal essays and stories. It can get a little bit overwhelming. So biggest thing that I would do is kind of figure out what it is you want your path to look like. And if you don't have a clear decision, at least come up with one that's the most compelling for you, and then really focus on building out the story behind that path and why it makes sense, and how you plan to get there, and just using that approach across the different applications.
Awesome, thanks. That's a really great tip, right? Like, be consistent, tell your story. You don't necessarily have to tweak your goals for each school, right? Just because the school, like you may think that the school may like a particular kind of a goal, but awesome. So let's talk a little bit about, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, on that point too, the schools will definitely be able to pick up in certain instances where you're being less genuine and more genuine. I think if the product management, for example, was kind of a far out, kind of just like I picked it out of the blue, and I really had no product management experience or background that kind of drew my interest to that area. So it wasn't very compelling. So if you're going to go with something that's kind of, it seems far stretched, at least have like some sort of story that connects you to that desired path or that desired like career outcome, right? It can't just be totally random where it's like there's no connection in between.
Awesome. Awesome, Simon. That's really great. Thanks for sharing your tips. What's the best way for, if somebody wants to connect with you, what do you think is the best way to reach out to you?
Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I would say that's the easiest way. I'm using emails. I have several different emails, so I'm happy to leave some emails if you want me to do that, Abhijay. But other than that, LinkedIn is the best approach.
Awesome. So I'll just pin up your LinkedIn in the description so that people can, reach out to you. And this has been great. So thanks a lot, Simon, for, volunteering your time and sharing all these insights. I hope that the candidates who are applying this application cycle, take from this and then, put their best foot forward for the applications. Thanks, Simon. Thanks for joining.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Abhijay, and best of luck to everyone who's going through that process or starting it soon.
Thanks everybody for viewing, and we'll see you all the next time.